Hi, welcome to Camp Talooli and Talooli Trails. Today we're going to go on a real trail hike over to the bog. This is one of my favorite activities to do with kids because the bog is such an unusual ecosystem. It's kind of a magical place to me. If we look around camp, people are used to the idea that plants live with their roots in the soil, collecting nutrients, their leaves up in the sun, collecting energy from the sky, and that's how they make their living. But on the bog, it's totally different. The bog is a specialized kind of pond where all the plants have to live without any soil. And today I'll show you just how they do that. To understand what a bog is, I'm going to show you a picture and I'm going to ask you to think of a cup of tea. If you've ever made tea, you take hot water and you add a tea bag which has leaves in it, and the water changes color and it becomes flavorful and you like drinking it. But the water also becomes a little acidic, and acidic isn't going to hurt you, but it changes it. I mean, you wouldn't take a cup of tea and water your plants with tea water. Because that tea water might not be good for the plants. And that's really what a bog is. I'll show you how it works. A bog starts out as a pond, a dent in the landscape where water fills in, but the difference with a bog is something is keeping the water from getting out. It doesn't drain well. In the case of the bog we're going to, there's a thick layer of clay on the very bottom of that bog, and so the water built up, and as plants lived and died, just like the tea bag, they stained the water a dark color, and they also made the water a little too acidic. That means most plants and animals can't live out here. I mean, sure, a tree could live on the shore with its roots in the soil. We all understand how that works. But how could plants live out here? Well, there are certain kinds of plants that are good at doing this. The bog plants like Spagna moss and cranberries and so forth. And so they can now colonize the areas that no other plants can live in. And over centuries, these plants start to float on the surface and they start to work their way out from the edge until today, our bog is a floating mat of Spagna moss with specialized plants, really cool plants, all floating out here, and we're gonna go walk on a floating bog. Come on, follow me. So like I said, we're used to plants growing with their roots in the soil, and this way is a forest. We're used to that. But if we look right over here, it's an open, sunny meadow. And this is because this is the bog. Once a shallow pond, now completely covered with vegetation. Let's go get our feet wet. Now it's easy for me to remember that most of New York State covered with land, covered with trees. And so New York State is almost entirely forested, except for a place like this. If you want to find true wilderness in New York State, for my money, go find a bog, because this is one of the places that the farmers would never have been able to clear. This is one of the places that didn't have forest for lumber products. So this is one of the few places where you can see nature pretty much as it's always been. And let's get down really close in this sunshiny bog meadow. Right down here is what drives the whole system. This plant is Spagna moss. And if I pull up just a little bit of it, you can see some cool things about it. It will float, it holds water, it has its green parts up here which collects the sunlight, and because the bog water is so acidic, this sphagnum can grow just fine, but it doesn't rot very much. And so, year after year after year, you get layer after layer, and the sphagnum here is probably about 1 to 2 feet thick. Below that sphagnum, there is water. We're literally floating on a pond. And if you don't believe me, watch what I can do with my stick. You ready? I can push through, about a foot or two in, and then suddenly, there's nothing. So that's all water down there. So it's easy to forget we're floating almost like a raft on a shallow pond. The sphagnum moss is the winner. It can tolerate these unusual wet, acidic conditions. And as the sphagnum moss moved its way out from the edges and covered the entire pond, then it became an environment where other bog plants could live. And I'll show you what I mean, but first, I love this trick. Sphagnum moss, people have known all over the world that this stuff is super absorbent. If I take it and I squeeze it, we can wring the water right out of it, and wring the water right out of it, and wring the water right out of it. In fact, ancient peoples around the world would collect sphagnum moss, dry it, and use it as an absorbent thing, like we would use paper towels or maybe paper diapers today. Come on down. Here is a tiny little plant, which most people have never seen, but everybody knows. This is cranberry. This is wild cranberry. And so cranberries can live in the acidic waters of a bog. And we have leather leaf, and we have Labrador tea, and we have bog rosemary, and all kinds of interesting plants that can grow nowhere else except here in a bog. But here on the bog, there are also plants that grow nowhere else, and they become trees. Let me show you. Now at Camp Talooli, there's lots of pine trees and lots of spruce trees, but the truth is, this tree could never live on the dry land because the other trees grow way faster than it does. This is a black spruce, and black spruce, you see them up in places like Alaska. You see them in tundra environments because black spruce has two tricks. It can live for a long time, but it only grows 1 inch or 2 inches a year. And it also can live in this soilless kind of acidic bog environment. So since none of the other trees can survive here, the black spruce has it pretty much all to itself. I like how cute its tiny little cones are. Two other plants that most of us know, but we don't necessarily know that they work well in bogs. One is blueberry, which is just had flowers and it's started to have green berries already. And down here is a flowering plant that most people know in their kitchens. This is bog rosemary. The plants that live in the bog don't have superpowers. It's just that they can live where none of the other plants can. For example, we have plants here that grow very slowly, too slow to compete with land plants, but there's no other plants to compete with. Let me show you my favorite bog plant. Come on close. This looks like a pitcher with a handle and a spout, and if we look close, it looks almost like blood veins going through the outside. And if you get even closer, next to those red marks, there are tiny little hairs. This is the pitcher plant. And the pitcher plant has figured out a perfect trick for living where there's no soil. It makes its own soil. I'll show you how pitcher plants work. I took one leaf off this long-lived plant. And if you look, it's easy to see why it's called a pitcher plant. And this very, very specialized leaf collects rainwater. It's all hollow on the inside. And the rainwater's all down inside. If I take my pocket knife and I start to cut into this leaf, you can see what it looks like on the inside. As we open up and look inside the pitcher plant, there's a pool of rainwater in there. And the plant actually secretes smells that attract insects, and those insects fall into the water, and the insects decompose in the enzymes produced by the plant. So the plant is actually, in the bottom, inside of it, actually making its own little ecosystem here. Now, if you look in the very bottom of the pitcher, you can see what looks like dirt, what looks like soil. This is the decomposed bodies of those insects. So literally it's making its own nutrient source. And that's not the weirdest thing. Some insects have figured out, you know how some insects live in water? Some insects have figured out if they lay their eggs in this water, that their insect larvae can actually live in there. So the pitcher plant not only lives in the bog, but it becomes its own little ecosystem. I'm going to cut the rest of this open so you can see the very bottom. See the accumulated decomposed plants and animals that are down there? That's its own soil, and it gets its nutrients this way. So as I hike back from the bog through the cool and dark forest, I'm always thinking that for thousands of years, most of New York would have been cool, dark forest. And if you just imagine how magical it would be to come upon a bog in those days where you have bright sunshine and flowering plants and hardly any trees. It's like a piece of wilderness history. This is Jeff for Talooli Trails. See you next time.